Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. It's great to see everybody here and what a lovely group of people. So this is great. Thank you online folks out there. Thank you for joining us and signing up for this Buddhism 101 class. We're really happy to be able to provide this here for everybody, and I hope that I'm up to the task to teaching the class. I mean, it's Buddhism 101, yet at the same time there's ideas and concepts that really take a long time to study and to integrate into your life and really understand. So I'm fairly certain I'm going to get in over my head at least once or twice, but I'll let you know when I'm drowning and say, hey, I don't know what I'm doing. Talk to His Holiness or something, So, but yeah, so anyway, so my name's Chris, and I'm the director here for at least for the summer here of the Way of Compassion Dharma Center, and I've been friends with John Bruna for a while. And we were actually, both of us were monks for a little bit, not together, but we both kind of took the monastic path for a little while. I spent a number of years in India studying under His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and not as a direct student, but receiving many teachings from him, as well as other some wonderful teachers over there as well, like Jetsume Tenzin Palmo and Songsar Khyentse Rinpoche and some others. So I'm by no means like a Buddhist teacher of any sort. So I want to make that clear right now that I'm really a practitioner who has maybe spent a little bit of time and effort studying the Dharma, but I've really only been studying and practicing for about 10 years. So that's not really a long time. So I just want to let you know that we're here to sort of like learn together. I've put together some course material that introduces some basic Buddhist concepts that will hopefully shed some light on this amazing, quite complicated at times and wonderful path known as Buddhism. But we're really just going to touch on things. We're just going to like have little tastes. It's going to be like a little tray of amuse-bouche, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and then we're just going to taste it and say like, that's nice, I like that, I want to learn more. And then I'll hopefully be able to give you some guidance in terms of like where to go next, some books that you can look at and teachers that you can learn from, so who will actually be able to explain things in a really, competent way, I guess you could say. So, so before we actually get started in the formal class here, there is a very common practice in Buddhism called generating motivation, generating the mind to benefit others, basically, the altruistic mind. So before we do any kind of Buddhist practice, we like to try to do that. So whether it's listening to a teaching, sitting down to meditate, doing any like complex, sadhana practice or anything like that, we just kind of just take a moment to reflect on our motivation. Why are we doing this thing? Setting ourselves up in a direction that's really positive. Because most of the time we just do things without even really thinking about it. And most of the time we're just kind of on autopilot. So we want to take a moment and just kind of just quietly come into ourselves and just kind of think, so why are we here? Why do we want to learn about Buddhism? Why do we want to learn more about this? Is it just to enrich our own lives? Is it to make ourselves feel good or happy? Is it to alleviate our own suffering? All of those motivations are fine. Of course, we want to call those to mind, but we also want to maybe expand our motivation a little bit and then also include others as well in our motivation. So we want to think to ourselves, may I listen to this, may I participate in this class with the aim to learn more about the Dharma, more about who and what the Buddha was all about, so that I can benefit not only myself but others as well. And then if we can, push the scope out even a little bit further and say like, may I also be able to benefit maybe all sentient beings, maybe not right now, but in the future, get to that point where it's like, may I be able to benefit all sentient beings, that would be great too. So let's go ahead and take that few minutes here to call that motivation to mind. Just think about why we're here and create a really positive motivation as big as we can. So having cultivated a good motivation, we can also, if we have some idea about the concept of Buddhist refuge, I know that a lot of you here are beginners, and that's fine. So maybe you don't understand, what refuge is, or maybe have never heard of it, or maybe you've heard of it, but just only have a vague notion of what it's all about. But basically, what we're talking about when we talk about refuge is saying the material world, the mundane worldly existence of everyday life is fine, but ultimately unsatisfactory. So what we want to do is just try to cultivate an idea of I'm going to go to refuge into something that goes a little bit beyond the worldly. And so if you can, just generate this idea that, the worldly is fine, nothing wrong with it, nothing wrong with material things and material existence and all that sort of stuff. But may I aspire to seek a higher truth than that. So that's kind of a little bit what refuge is about. We're going to talk about refuge later on in the course a little bit more, but just kind of generate a sense of a feeling of refuge in something that is trustworthy, something like the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. And if you don't have any idea what that's all about, don't worry, just try your best. Okay. So here we go. Let's give this a try now. I don't really know what's going to happen, so let's have some fun with it. All right. So just a little bit about this class. So it's a 4-week class. Once again, every Tuesday for the next 4 Tuesdays. And we're going to just talk about some basic Buddhist concepts. It's an introductory class, but I wanted it to be something where it's okay, let's address this situation where a lot of people come to Buddhism or are interested in Buddhism, and they walk in the door to a room like this, and they look around and they go oh my God, what's going on? What are all these images, and what are all these things on the shrine, and what are all these strange vocabulary words? And it can be really, really overwhelming. A lot of Sanskrit terminology, a lot of Tibetan terminology gets thrown out there. There's people bowing, and there's people mumbling, incomprehensible stuff, and it's what's going on, So my aim and John's aim of this class is to just kind of just talk about some of those things, but also we're going to talk about some Buddhist concepts, some of the Buddhist teachings, some of these foundational teachings that can be just by their nature quite challenging. So it's not going to be a watered down class either. It's not going to be like a children's book class. But at the same time, we don't want to be getting too deep into it because, like I mentioned before, I'm not so qualified to go that deep. But at the same time, we want to try to just embrace the fact that this is a pretty profound tradition. These concepts are really amazing, and the path that the Buddha taught, and this is the Buddha Shakyamuni right behind us here, an image of him actually attaining enlightenment at the moment that he attains enlightenment, taught a path that was really, really useful, even to this day. It was well over 2,500 years ago. Their estimates now are that it might be even 3,000 years ago that the Buddha, the historical Buddha existed, attained enlightenment, and then taught for about 40 years. But so it's a very profound path, a very useful path. So we're going to get into some stuff that sometimes is a little bit meaty, but don't be afraid of that. Let's just know that's what we're getting ourselves into a little bit here. So I have about 3 weeks of course material laid out. The 4th week, though, I have kind of open. So I want you guys to kind of think about, if you're going to continue for the full 4 weeks, to just think about and jot down little notes about things that you want to know about Buddhism, things that you're like, like what is that? What's that prostration thing all about? Or, why do we take our shoes off when we go in the shrine room? Or what are the offering bowls on the shrine all about, and things like that. So just jot down some notes, and then let me know in the next couple of weeks or so, whether email or let me know here in class or whatever, and we'll try to make a class that sort of like meets all of our needs together. So and that'll be like our final class, and we'll talk about a bunch of different things that you guys find useful and are interested in. Okay, so that all being said, let's go ahead and get started into week 1 here, and I wanted to start with maybe kind of the obvious, which is like, who is the Buddha? Oh yeah, sorry about that.
It's fine.
Yeah. So who is the Buddha? Yeah. I mean, this is a major question, and sometimes it's something that gets swept under the rug sometimes a little bit. People are just jumping right into the teachings and meditation practice. And in the Tibetan tradition, there's a lot of like rituals and prayers and chants and all kinds of things like that. And sometimes the historical Buddha, who he was, what he did, and what he taught, it's all in there. But it's nice sometimes to come back to the actual story that's told over and over and over again of the Buddha's life. Okay, so I'm basing tonight's talk a little bit, the portion on the Buddha's life, on this book here. It's called The Buddha, His Life Retold by Robert Allen Mitchell. And it's an amazing book. This guy was, I think he wrote this back in the 40s or 50s or something like that. He had a correspondence going with Albert Einstein. He was a super, super brilliant genius guy who worked as a landscaper or something like that. He taught himself Pali. He just said, I'm going to learn Pali, because he was a Buddhist. He discovered Buddhism and decided, this is great, I love it. So he just said, I should learn the original language that all of the sutras, all of the teachings of the Buddha were written in, and then I'll just translate them, on my own. Yeah, so, okay, sounds good, man. All right, Robert, you do that. Go for it. But anyway, this is a really, really beautiful book. If you have any interest in all in reading the life story of the Buddha, really from the time of his birth, even before his birth, actually, up to his birth, all the way through his early life, into his study and practice of meditation, up to the point he attained enlightenment, and then his entire life of teaching after that. This is, in my opinion, the book. So it's really, really good. It really inspired me when I first started, and I've started reading it again, and it's so beautiful. So we're going to base a little bit of this talk on this. So let's just talk about the story of the Buddha. This is about 2,500 years ago, maybe 3,000 years ago. The way the story is normally told is in this very grand Indian style, this really amazing sort of epic, poetic style that uses this incredible imagery, and it just sounds, at first read, to be like, kind of like, oh, this is malarkey, this didn't really happen. How could any of these things possibly have happened? Things like that. And the thing is, we just have to understand, that's the mythological style of storytelling from those times, when these incredible images are being used to convey actual truths. It's not, Joseph Campbell said, you don't want to mistake the metaphor for for the truth, what's being conveyed here. So a lot of what's being talked about in the Buddha's life story that's told in this grand Indian style is sometimes it's metaphor, but sometimes it's it's true, and it's rooted in fact as well. So we have to be able to discern, and we have to understand that this story is being told to inspire us. That's the main thing. It's being told to inspire us to investigate our situation in life, to work on suffering, to take some responsibility for the fact that, we're in a situation where we're suffering, but we can do something about that. And then we can look to the example of the Buddha's life and say, like, okay, so what did he do? What steps did he follow to get there? And it's sort of like it's a blueprint for how to deal with the main issues of human suffering and human existence, the main problems, and attain enlightenment, attain freedom from that suffering. So when we're talking about the Buddha story, it can get really dramatic really fast. So it starts out with the Buddha's mother-to-be has taken a vow of celibacy. So she doesn't want to have any children. Well, she has a dream one night, and she goes to this place called the Tushita Heaven. And it's this incredible dream. It's super vivid, and there's all these gods and goddesses around, and they're coming up to her, and they're just saying you are really special, and something really special is about to happen to you. So they lay her down on this bed, and she's just laying there, and this white elephant, this 6-tusked white elephant, comes into the room, and it is this elephant does 3 circumambulations around her, and then enters into her side. And it's said that this being, this Buddha, or is this being, this elephant is the Buddha. So I'll just read a little bit of the story here, just so you can kind of get a sense for the language and just kind of the beauty of it, that I'm not doing it justice. So Queen Maya dreamed that the 4 celestial kings raised her together with the couch and conveyed her over the Himalayan range to the high tableland of Tibet. And having arrived at a spot beyond the lofty peaks, they set her down under a jewel-spangled tree and stood respectfully at one side. Then the wives of the 4 celestial kings came and conducted her to a shimmering mountain lake in which they bathed her to remove every human stain. And after clothing her in divine garments, the goddesses anointed her with heavenly perfumes and decked her with celestial flowers. Nearby was a silver mountain surmounted by a golden mansion. Now the 4 gods and their wives prepared a divine couch with its head to the east, and upon it they laid Queen Maya. A star blazing with supernal splendor descended from Tushita Heaven, and then a superb white elephant was to be seen wandering about on the hill. Approaching from the north, the magnificent animal plucked a white lotus with its silvery trunk, and trumpeting loudly, he entered the golden mansion. Walking around the future mother's couch 3 times, keeping his right side toward it, he struck Queen Maya on her right side and disappeared, mysteriously entering her womb. And thus the Bodhisattva, which is what they call the Buddha before he became a Buddha, the Bodhisattva was conceived in the womb of Queen Maya on the full moon day of Asada. Now, then this is really beautiful too. So this is this wonderful poetic language. Now at the moment when the Bodhisattva made himself incarnate in his mother's womb, the atoms constituting 10,000 world systems vibrated, all at the same instant, and a measureless light shone irradiant over all. Good omens were made manifest, the blind received their sight, as if from yearning to behold the glory of the great being. The deaf heard the sound, the dumb uttered praise of the great being, the deformed were straightened, the crippled were healed, prisoners in chains were freed from bondage. So it's just this beautiful, inspiring story, and and really what it's signaling is not that this dream ever happened. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I'm not one to say. But what it's saying is this is an extraordinary person that's about to be born. And pretty much every religious tradition and mythological tradition has this sort of motif of the virgin birth kind of a thing. And again, it's not whether it's true or not, or whether it's possible or not, but it's just a story, a motif that communicates to us that this is an extraordinary person. How many people in the world have truly touched so many millions of lives over so many centuries? There are a few, there's Muhammad, there's Jesus, there's the Buddha, but it's really just a handful. So these truly are extraordinary people who have this innate spiritual genius, who are able to move so many people in such a way and convey truth in such a way that it's truly transformative. So the whole purpose of the story is to convey that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about an ordinary person. We're talking about someone who's pretty extraordinary, almost like as rare as stars in broad daylight, kind of extraordinary. So she has this wonderful dream, and she wakes up and she goes and she tells her husband, "Oh, I had this dream, and I'm pregnant." And he's like, "Oh, okay. Well, that sounds pretty auspicious. That sounds pretty exciting. I mean, they believed that kind of stuff at that time, so that magical things like that happened. So her husband, who's a king in this area of northern India, says, well, if you've had this extraordinary dream, about this miraculous birth here, we should bring some priests, some Brahmins, and maybe they can do some divination and tell us a little bit more about this child. So they call a bunch of Brahmins, a bunch of priests. Brahmins are the high caste of India. They keep all of the spiritual knowledge and stuff, and all the rituals and all that sort of thing. So they come and they do their divinations, and all of them say, like, yes, this is a truly extraordinary child. And the king asks, well, do you have any prophecy for him as to what he's going to accomplish in this life? And they said, yes. There's two possibilities for this child. Either, so if he lives the household life, if he lives just an ordinary, mundane life as a prince of you, the king, and he does not get exposed to the sufferings of the world, then he will become a universal monarch, a world ruler. He will take your place as king, but he will rule this vast empire. And the king's like, yeah, nice, I like that. That's going to be cool, because then, I live on, and everyone's going to remember me because I'm like the monarch's son. But they said, well, wait a minute. Okay, well, that's one possibility. The other possibility is that if he sees the four signs, and the four signs are an old person, a sick person, a dead person, or a dying person, and a ascetic, someone who's renounced the worldly life, then he is going to renounce everything, and he's going to attain liberation from suffering, from samsara, and become what's known as a Buddha, an awakened one, and be, instead of a material monarch or a material king of a material realm, he's going to become a spiritual emperor kind of a thing, a Buddha. So the king's like, oh man, I don't want any of that. I don't want any of that, because that would bring shame upon me and my family and my name and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, so this is just before, this is a little while before he's born. So he's making a plan already to himself what he's going to do about that. So Queen Maya, after about 10 months or so, she's coming to near the end of her pregnancy. At that time, a young woman would go to her family's house or estate or whatever to give birth. And so she was making that journey. And on the way, she stopped in this place in what's called Nepal today, called Lumbini, which is this beautiful grove of mango trees and beautiful flowers and gardens and things like that. And she stopped there to rest for a little bit. She went under this beautiful tree, and she just leaned over on the tree, and then out from her side, the child who was to be the Buddha just sprung out of her side and just magically was on the ground. It said that he took 7 steps. And he said, and he pointed up and he pointed down, and he said, neither above nor below has there ever been one born such as me. And he spoke those words, kind of prophesizing his own enlightenment, actually. So anyway, so the child's born. They go back to the king's palace. There's all these celebrations, and it's wonderful. Everything's great. There's another prophecy given as well, that again, he's got the two choices. Either he's going to become a king of the worldly world, or he's going to become a Buddha. And so it's at that moment that King Sudana says, there's no way that's going to happen. And he makes a vow to say, like, I'm going to make sure that this child of mine, this son, never sees any suffering whatsoever. He's going to have just only the best. He's going to have only the most beautiful people taking care of him. He's going to have only the most beautiful food. He's going to never see any old people or sick people or anything like that. So that's how the Buddha grew up, actually, until he was much later on in life. So until well after he got married. So this went on until he was about 29, where this king said, like, no way, he's not going to see anything that's going to inspire him to renounce the worldly life and take up the spiritual path. So he's surrounded with just the most beautiful of everything and the best of everything. And it would be like someone today, like, living in Malibu. They got, they get like a cell phone when they're like 3, and they're just like, wearing like posh jewelry and, little, Gucci bags and stuff like that, and just diamond everything, and big screen TVs everywhere, So yeah, they get a Ferrari at their 16th birthday. What's that?
No TV.
Oh yeah, no, well yeah, well, but only so very very monitored. What they can watch. So only happy stories. So that's kind of the life he lived. And again, whether this is a true story or not, it does happen. In people's lives. We live these sheltered lives. We actually shelter ourselves from the sufferings of the world, from the truth of suffering all the time, and we pretend to ourselves, whether we have a ton of money or not, that oh yeah, everything's great, and this life I'm living, I'm pretty happy, and things are pretty good, but we don't really we put the blinders on when it comes to the truth of the unsatisfactoriness of this world. So this is the situation that the young Buddha to be is in, except it's kind of being foisted on him by his father. So anyway, he gets married when he's about 16. Time goes by. They finally are about to have a child, actually, and so from about 16 to 29, it said that there was this discontent in the Buddha's heart, in the soon-to-be Buddha's heart, and he was surrounded by all this luxury and all this ease, but he was still just like, there's something not right about this. It's just not satisfying. He just couldn't put his finger on it, what it was. And so then one day he gets in his chariot, and his charioteer, his good friend, takes him out to this other part of town. And the gods are intervening at this point. Actually, they're saying like, enough of this, cushy life, Buddha to be. You need to see this stuff because, you need to become a Buddha. You can't just live your life just, drinking Cristal. And and so on the way from the palace to this little town just outside the palace walls, he sees on the way a sick person. And this person is just kind of wasting away, and they're not well, and the color of their skin is very pallid, and they just kind of look kind of terrifying, probably a leper or something like that. And the Buddha says to his charioteer, he's like, "What is going on here? Stop. What's the deal?" And so I'll read a little bit from the book here. What, Chandaka, has that man done, that his eyes are not like others' eyes, nor his voice like the voice of other men? He is what is called sick, master. Sick? Are all people liable to sickness? Yes, master. Then I too could become such as this, I, the glory of the Shakyas, that's his family name, the glory of the Shakyas. Let us return to the palace. Enough of going to the park. So he doesn't want to, he's just like, he's horrified, he's never seen anything like this before. So he goes back, and his father learns about the fact that he went out and he saw this sick person, and he's like, okay, Chandaka, you have to make sure that he doesn't see this stuff. Okay, I told you that before. You're going to screw everything up. So the next day comes around, and Chandaka says, yes, of course, I'll do my best. The next day comes, he goes out, and again the gods intervene, and they show the Buddha an old person. So he sees an old person, and he goes through the same sort of shock and horror, and he's like, because he's just this young, beautiful, bathed in oil and perfume and incense, hottie, and he's just like, and that's all he's ever seen, and so, he sees an old person, and he's like, you got to be kidding me. I mean, what is that? And Chandaka's like, that's an old person, and that's what's going to happen to all of us. And he's like, me too? And he's like, yeah, you too. And he's like, oh, I don't want to go to the park anymore. So they go back to the palace. And again, the king's furious and scolds the charioteer and says, he's only got 2 more things that he's going to see, and then he's going to leave me. So they go out the next day, and again the gods interfere, and they show him then a person he's being taken to a funeral pyre. And there's a sheet over him. There's a white sheet over him. But the gods send a wind down that blows the sheet over, and the Buddha then sees the corpse of this dead person, and he's completely just freaked out. He's like, what is that? I mean, there's just no life in it whatsoever. It's just this lifeless, shrunken, hideous corpse. And so again, he goes through the same thing with his charioteer, who says, like, Siddhartha, that's his name. Siddhartha, that's a dead person, and that's what's in store for all of us. We're all going to die. And he's like, you got to be kidding me. I had no idea. And so they go back to the palace, okay, and so he's just completely disheartened, and he's just like, this is just terrible, you know. So again, the next day comes, and he tries to go to the park again, and then the gods intervene again, and they show him a monk, an ascetic, a person who has renounced the worldly life and is seeking truth and liberation, and through meditation and through all these spiritual practices. And so the Buddha says, what is that guy? Looks amazing. He's like, that guy's smiling, he's radiant, he looks happy, he looks at peace, he looks joyful. Chandaka, what is that person? And Chandaka's like, that's an ascetic, that's a monk, that's someone who's renounced the worldly life and has decided to devote all of his energy and all of his life force into finding out the truth about who we are and our place in the world and what we're supposed to do with our lives. And the Buddha says, yeah, that's cool. I want to do that. So he goes back to the palace, and he all but tells his father and his actually it's his aunt. His mother passed away after childbirth. I did forget to tell you that. But anyway, so he tells his father and his aunt that it's like, I've decided I'm gonna give all this up. I don't want to be the prince anymore. I'm gonna be an ascetic. I'm gonna be a spiritual wanderer. And they're just like, no, you can't do that, you know. So they try to hold him back, but basically he escapes. So one night, they tried to like basically ply him with one more like big last hurrah, one big party, and they throw this huge party, and there's like, you know, beautiful dancers and most exquisite food and wine and all this sort of stuff, and it's just like a full-on rave, you know, and he's just like completely disillusioned though, and he's like, it's just boring, and so he falls asleep. And so all the dancers that are dancing and performing for him, and you know, very sensual and very gorgeous and alluring and everything, they all look at him and they're just like, he just fell asleep. I mean, you know, like, look at us, we're awesome, and like he's falling asleep. So they decide like, well, this is for the birds. We're just going to fall asleep too. So they all just kind of pass out in this you know, pleasure garden room or whatever. The Buddha wakes up in the middle of the night, and he looks around, and he sees just like the aftermath of this wanton party, and he sees all these people just passed out, and he just looks at them all with just disgust, and all he sees is just these horrible twisted shapes, people drooling on the pillows and just snoring, and all these people that are, you know, all these that before were portrayed as being, you know, the objects of desire, and you know, this is what life is all about: pleasure, sensuality, you know, wonderful food, wonderful, you know, tastes and experiences and all like that, are all just impermanent and really just at their core unsatisfying. And he just looks around and he says, no, this ain't it. So he gets his charioteer, Chandaka, I think. I always forget his name. And he says, saddle up the horse and I'm out of here. So his friend takes him all the way through the rest of the night. When the dawn comes, he says, okay, you just go back and just tell them that I'm gone. He takes his sword out, he cuts his hair, which is the symbol of his clan, of his princehood, and he embarks on this life of being a spiritual seeker. So, yes, as I suspected, this is going long, but it's a good story. So he's renounced the worldly life. He's left the palace. He's left his wife and his child behind. Actually, that's how strong his renunciation is. You might call it irresponsible, but really, it's really not. It's really quite brave. He doesn't, you know, it's not that he hates his wife. It's not that he hates his child. It's just that he's saying like, this householder life is only going to get in the way of finding liberation, finding nirvana, finding peace, finding the truth. So he spends the next 6 years studying, practicing, meditating, engaging in extreme austerities and ascetic practices. And you have to understand, at India at the time, there was a lot of people doing these sorts of things. There was a lot of people out there that were like, nope, I'm going to find what's called moksha, or liberation, or nirvana. and seeking for the highest spiritual truth. It was an incredible, incredible time. There was a lot of teachers teaching vast amounts of students. There was a lot of individuals who on their own were going out and doing all these practices, like not eating, not drinking water, holding their breath, standing on one leg, walking around with one arm up in the air for their entire lifetimes. All these like weird things to basically develop these states of concentration and meditative absorption that they hoped would get them to a state of final liberation from what's called the wheel of existence, the round of birth and death. And so the Buddha studied with a lot of them. He studied with, or Siddhartha at the time, Siddhartha studied with a lot of them, a lot of the greatest spiritual philosophers of his time. And actually, he was quite a spiritual genius himself. He had this spiritual intuition. So when he went to study with these great spiritual masters, he would actually become very adept at their teachings in a very short period of time. He would basically master what they were, these profound teachings very quickly, within a matter of months or a year or so. And he would then actually exceed the abilities of his teachers. And then his teachers would be like, well, I mean, there's nothing else I can teach you, or they would say like, well, why don't you teach with me, and then we'll make a lot of money or whatever. So, but he was like, no, just what you're teaching, the meditation you're teaching is good. The state that you're attaining is a good state, but it's not the final liberation. It's not the final nirvana that I'm looking for. I'm looking for a cessation of suffering. I'm looking for the end of this major problem. And what is the problem? We all get old, we all get sick, and we all die. And we do it, and we don't just do it once. We do it again and again and again and again and again, endlessly. There's no beginning to it, and there's no end to it. And that was what caused him really to renounce and to go out and to seek this truth. So he does this for about 6 years, studying with all these teachers. Then he goes off on his own, and he says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this hardcore. I'm going to starve my body. I'm going to get myself to a point where I'm just completely admonishing this body, and maybe that's going to do it. So he does all these severe practices. He's only eating, in this text it says that for a period of time he only eats the juice squeezed from some lentils and rice. So just a little bit of that just to keep him alive. So he does things like that. He holds his breath for as long as he possibly can until there's this searing, blinding pain in his head. And still that doesn't quite get him there. So he does all these practices until he's just wasting away. And it looks like he's going to die, actually. So at this point, he's got a couple of students that have gathered around him, these 5 ascetics who are following him and saying yeah, this guy is intense. This guy is hardcore. He's got to get it at some point. He's got such drive. Look at him. He's like skin and bones. He really wants it. So they started to follow him because of his passion and his drive. And so they're supporting him throughout this period of asceticism, severe asceticism. But then one day, Siddhartha is sitting there and he's thinking I don't have much longer. I've got a few days left, maybe tops, and I'm going to be dead. And I haven't gotten anywhere closer to this final liberation that I've been seeking. So at that point, he thinks to himself, I think there's got to be another way. There's got to be a way that's more balanced, a middle way. And he starts to get the seed of that idea. And so he starts, he has his friends make him some rice and some rice gruel, and he starts to eat. And his friends just look at him with disgust and say you've given up the path. You're not really serious anymore. You lost your nerve, and so they bail on him. So anyway, so he's like, that's fine, no big deal. So he just continues to eat, and he starts to bathe himself again and start taking care of his body a little bit. But he continues to do his meditation, and he starts to do his meditation now with sort of a different attitude, with a looser approach. So instead of being really intense, concentrating, he just goes, and just concentrates in a much more relaxed way, and says, you know what, this is where it's at, all right? I got to take care of my body. I don't know how to pamper it, but if I'm dead, I'm no good to nobody. Yeah, so so instead of going those two extremes, either destroying his body or pampering it too much, he decides I'm going to go this middle direction, this middle way. So so he does that for a little while by the river Ganges. He's near this place in India called Bodh Gaya. And so he's kind of doing that for a little while, and he's got a nice routine going. And at that time, there was in a village nearby this young woman named Sujata, who was this young woman who prayed to the gods to please, bring me it's kind of, okay, it's a little patriarchal, but bring me a husband who's gonna, you make me happy, and I'll have a wonderful kid, and that'll make me really happy. Okay, well, maybe that will make her happy. I don't know. Who am I to judge? But anyway, so the gods grant her that wish, and she made this promise: if you grant me this wish, I will go into the forest, and to this particular tree, I will make an offering of rice and rice milk in a bowl worth 100,000 pieces of money. So she gets her husband. She conceives a child, and she said she was going to fulfill her wish. So she walks into the forest one day with this offering, and at that particular time, the Buddha, or Siddhartha at the time, had sat down in front of that particular tree in the forest to meditate, and she thought like, oh, there's the God manifesting to accept my offering. So she goes and she puts the offering down, and he looks at her and he says, I'm not the God. So you don't really have to give that to me. And she says, you know what? There's something about you. You seem pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead and give you the offering anyway. And she just walked away without any care for the fact. It was a beautiful Tiffany bowl. I think it was extraordinary. So really expensive. So with this wonderful rice milk offering. So because of that generosity, the Buddha was really inspired by that, and it was sort of like something that he sort of needed to give him the final resolve. So it's like right after that, he says, you know what, this is it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to attain enlightenment. So he walks a little bit down the river, and on the way he meets this guy that's cutting this kusha grass. It's called, this sweet grass. And the guy looks at him and says hey, you want some handfuls of grass? Looks like you want to make a seat to do something. And so the Buddha says, yeah, sure. So he takes 8 handfuls of kusha grass. He says, I'm going to use this as my seat to attain enlightenment. And the guy says, awesome. That's great. I feel good about that. So the Buddha goes and he finds this tree to sit under. He lays out his kusha grass. He sits down and he says, this is it. I'm not going to get up until I attain the final complete enlightenment. I don't care how long I have to sit here. And so he does. So he sits down, and then the real challenge begins. Then what happens is that his mind starts to really throw all of these obstacles at him. And they call this deity, this god called Mara, who is the god of the world, the tempter. And he's kind of like this Satan sort of character in the sense that he's an obstacle maker. He's an obstacle maker for Siddhartha attaining enlightenment because he doesn't want people to attain liberation. He's happy, like everyone's basically is controlled by their sensual desires, by their fear, by their grasping, by their delusions, by their ignorance, by their selfishness. All these sorts of things keep us from understanding who our true nature, our Buddha nature. So he's just like, loves it. He's like, yeah, all these people are mine. They're all mine, and no one's going to get away. And so this god, Mara, who is really just, I think, our own solidified ego, our own ego grasping, staring back at us, sends all of these armies of temptation, of fear, of you can't do it, doubt, all this sort of stuff at the Buddha as he's sitting there in meditative equipoise. And he's tempting him with all these sensual pleasures, and he says, like, if you get it from your seat right now, you can have my 3 beautiful daughters. If you get it from your seat right now, you can be a king of the world. I'll give you this whole universe. If you get it from your seat right now, I'll give you like whatever you want. And the Buddha says, no, absolutely not. And so he says, all right, now I'm going to get tough. So he says, he gets his armies together, and he says, well, we can't get him from the front, so we'll try to get him from behind. So he sends his armies behind him, and he starts shooting all these arrows of fear and doubt and, accusation and shame and guilt and all these things. And, like, who are you to sit there and think that you can attain liberation? And, it's like, what are you kidding? You're just some rich boy, some trust fund baby. Come on. And again, the Buddha just sits there, and he's like, I'm not going to be distracted from this meditative equipoise. And so finally Mara gets totally frustrated, and he's just like, he's thrown everything at him that he can think of. And finally he just says, like, who do you think you are? Like, you have no right to be sitting there. I'm the one who's supposed to be sitting there. Who is the witness to you doing anything to get here whatsoever? And the Buddha says, like, well, you don't have any witnesses for you to be sitting here, for you to justify being sitting here. But I do, because at this point he's gone into such deep meditative equipoise that he started to remember his past lives. And he started to remember all of the things that he did, all of the good karma, all of the merit that he's generated to be here in this spot over countless lifetimes, giving, I forget what it's called, but there's 5 things that one needs to give before one attains Buddhahood, and it's like you got to give away your kids, you got to give away your spouse, you got to give away all your estate, all of your money, of course, and all that sort of stuff. You got to give away one other thing, and then of course your life you have to give for the benefit of others, completely selflessly. You have to be completely selfless, and have generated all this merit through countless lifetimes. And so Mara says, well, who's a witness for you doing all those things? And he takes his hand and he gently rests it over his knee, and he touches the earth, and he says, the earth is my witness, because I've been born on this earth countless times and have done these things here. And so the earth then shakes and rattles and says, yes, I'm the Siddhartha's witness. And at that moment Mara dissipates, completely vanishes, and the Buddha attains enlightenment at that point, complete liberation, because he sees through grasping, he sees through ego, he sees through delusion, and he just breaks through everything. So what he says at the very end of that whole drama is this right here. He says, looking for the maker of this house, I have run through a course of many births, not finding him, and painful is birth again and again. But now, maker of this house, you are seen. You shall not construct this house again. All your rafters are broken, your ridgepole is shattered. Having sundered the bonds of craving, liberation is won. And then at the end of this particular sutra, it says, done was all that was needed to be done. And so the Buddha attains enlightenment at that point, and he becomes what's called the Buddha, so the awakened one. So there's other things that happen after that, a few other things, but we won't get into them right now. But basically, it's at that point that he, after a short while, he begins to teach. At first, he's quite a bit reluctant to, because the truth that he's discovered, he realizes that it's really, really subtle. And it's really hard. He just knows people, and he knows that it's going to be really hard to convince people that they're suffering, really, because we all deny it. We're all just in complete denial. We're like, I'm not suffering, not that bad. Yeah, once in a while I get a headache. Once in a while, I don't get what I want, and but mostly things are pretty good. Yeah, occasionally there's catastrophe and things like that, but this thing called samsara is pretty good. This thing called material existence. It's really not that bad. Pretty much I'm okay. So there's that, and then there's also the fact that the realization that he came to was just very hard to describe without it becoming confusing. So he was like, I don't think I should teach. Nobody's going to get it. They're not going to want to anyway. But the gods come to him and they say, no, really, no. You're the Buddha now. You're awakened. You have to teach other people. You have to show people how to get out of suffering. And he's like, no. They're just not going to get it. They're not going to get it. So they come and they ask him 3 times. That's how the story goes. And so finally he says, okay, all right, I'll teach. I'll do it. So he goes actually and he finds the five companions that he had who left him, who kind of took off on him, and he finds them in this place called Sarnath, outside of Deer Park, just outside of Varanasi in India, and they're hanging out and they're still doing their ascetic practices and whatever, flagellating themselves, whatever they're doing, and they see this guy walking in the distance and they're like, whoa. He's like radiating, man. This guy is like, there's something else, He's like, this is some special being coming towards us. And he gets up closer, and then they realize, oh, it's that slacker Siddhartha, And they're like, dude, what happened? You changed. And he said, yeah, my name's not Siddhartha anymore. I'm the Buddha. I'm the one who woke up. So they immediately just start prostrating to him, and because they recognize that he found it. He found the ultimate liberation, and so they become his first students. So then he does what's called the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. So right there in that spot in Sarnath, India, and they have a stupa there that's erected to commemorate more or less the spot where they believe it that actually happened. It's hard to say, but but anyway, there's a big monument built there to commemorate that spot. And he gave the first teaching of the Dharma. It's called the first turning of the wheel. And this first turning of the wheel was on a subject called the Four Noble Truths. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second here. So that was the first thing that the Buddha taught. And then after that, it was just on. It was like he taught these five guys, and then they attained realization like immediately, because they were almost ready anyway. But because the Buddha's realization, Jetsuma Tenzin Palmo, who's a wonderful Buddhist nun in India, said something that was really inspiring. It's like his realization was like white hot. So it's like just to be close to him, you were just like, your delusions were just burned away. So especially if you had the karma to be there at that time, just immediately you attained liberation just by hearing his speech, especially at that moment. But those guys had special karma together. So after that, he starts teaching, and he just doesn't stop so he's about 30. It's about 36 at that time that he attains enlightenment, and he doesn't pass away until he's 80. So for those 44 years, he just is nonstop teaching of the Dharma. He establishes the monastic tradition of both monks and nuns, and he just teaches and teaches and teaches. And there are literally roomfuls of books, the sutras they're called, that you could fill a room of volumes of his spoken teachings that were memorized, that were passed down as an oral tradition, and then finally written down a few hundred years later. So he just taught a lot. But there's three main categories of his teachings. There's the first turning of the wheel, which is the Four Noble Truths. Then there's the second turning of the wheel, it's called, which he gave a little bit later is a little more miraculous. He gave it to a bunch of people, human beings, but he was also teaching on another level to other dimensions as well, it said, to Buddhas and Bodhisattvas from other world systems and things like that. And this second turning of the wheel took place also near Bodh Gaya, where he attained enlightenment in a place called Rajgir. And that was primarily about emptiness, the subject of emptiness, which we'll touch it just a little bit today. And then the third turning of the wheel, which he gave later on, which is a very profound teaching, which again was something that was quite miraculous, it is said, was on what's called the inherent Buddha nature of all beings. So anyone who's a sentient being, essentially, so he's a Buddha, which means an awakened one. He has absolutely no obscurations. He's purified all of his negative karma. He's just completely omniscient mind, just pure mind awareness, awakeness. Everybody has that at the core of their being, and everybody can eventually get there by working it and working it pretty hard. But that essentially our nature is Buddha nature. Essentially our nature is basic goodness, it's said. So those are those teachings. So those three basic categories of teachings. So we're not going to go too much into the second and third turning of the wheel, largely because of time, but also I wouldn't want to touch on that myself. But we'll talk about the Four Noble Truths a little bit, because that's pretty foundational and pretty important to understand. the Buddha's first teaching. What did he teach first? And to recognize that because he taught it first, it's pretty important. It is sort of the culmination of that whole 6 years. It is the realization that he came to over those 6 years of ascetic practice, and then meditative practice, and then middle way practice, and then finally attaining enlightenment. And this thing is called the Four Noble Truths. And what he realized is that there's four basic things that we need to understand if we want to follow this path to liberation ourselves. So the first thing that he talked about was the truth of suffering. And suffering is a bad word, actually, to use for the translation of the Sanskrit and even the Tibetan word, because it implies, again, it can lead us off track, and we can think, again, like, I'm not suffering. I mean, I'm fine right now. I got Netflix, fridge is full. I got clothes, I got a car. Car payment, yeah, that's kind of a drag, but, at least I got money to pay for that. So anyway, so we have this kind of thinking, like, I'm not suffering. But the word in Sanskrit, dukkha, actually means more along the lines of unsatisfactoriness, of, like, ultimately disappointing. And and if we look at it from that point of view, and we really examine our lives closely, then yeah, we can kind of get to that, I think, a little bit more. We can really kind of accept that a little bit more. Yeah, I've got Netflix, but man, these shows are just the same all the time, and I'm just kind of getting bored with it, It's just ultimately unsatisfying. Or like a really good show, Breaking Bad. I watched it, and it was awesome, and then it was over, and now it's done, or Ben and Jerry's ice cream, it's really is delicious. I mean, at least to me, and everything but is like awesome, because it's like ice cream and candy together, mixed up, and it's great. But, like, I can only eat so much of it before I get sick, number one. And number two, like, eventually, it's done. Again, it's this impermanence thing. So if we look at this word suffering, which, yes, there is gross suffering that we're talking about here, but the larger sort of thing that we're talking, that is this truth of suffering, is this truth of this bum ride that life is. It's ultimately unsatisfactory. Because why? Because no matter how good things are, we're going to get old, we're going to get sick, we're going to die, we're going to lose everything. Everything that we have right now is impermanent, and we're going to lose it. So we can't rely on it. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the truth of suffering that the Buddha taught about a lot. He talked about different types of suffering, and I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about that a little more depth in another class next week or so. So that's the truth of suffering. Now if you stop there, then, like, the Buddhist teaching gets a bad rap for this first one, because it's like, the Buddha just says life is a bummer, and what's the point? And it's like it's a pessimistic downer of a philosophy. And the truth of the matter is, like, absolutely not. It is not a downer whatsoever. That's only the first noble truth. And we have to understand that. We have to accept that. We have to accept we have to not just accept it, we have to investigate and realize for ourselves and come to the conclusion ourselves that life is unsatisfactory in its current form. But then what do we do with that knowledge? So we have to investigate it pretty deeply. So then he goes into this, the second noble truth, which is the truth of the origin of suffering. So the Buddha said, yeah, life is suffering, life is unsatisfactory, but there's a reason for that. It's not just like, well, screw it then, I might as well just have as good a time as I can and just make the best of it. He's like, no, wait, hold on, wait for it. There's a reason that life is unsatisfactory, that ultimately, doesn't satisfy, make us happy, ultimately. So what is that reason? In a lot of the sutras, it's called craving or grasping. And this is something that he goes into great detail to talk about. What is this nature? What is this grasping? What is this craving? What is this all about? And what it is it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how things exist. All right? So normally we look at stuff and we say, like, I'm here, I'm me, and we grasp onto that idea of there's a solid me here. And then we look outside of ourselves and we say that we see the Ben and Jerry's ice cream, and we say, that's Ben and Jerry's ice cream, and that's good, and I want that, and if I get that, I'm going to be happy, and it's going to make me happy. But then we're left at the end kind of just like bummed out, we're just, it's gone, So the reason that we suffer is because of that fundamental ignorance, because we grasp at a self that if we investigate it a little bit, and we have to do a lot of investigating, isn't really permanent. It's always changing. It's always depending on all kinds of other conditions. And also those objects outside of us also are not permanent. They're also always changing. They're also dependent on all sorts of things, not the least of which is our label that we put on it as being either good or bad, or something that you want or something you don't want, and things like that. So this is the fundamental reason why we suffer, because we think these things are permanent and real. I'm permanent and real. I'm never going to change. This thing is never going to change. This thing is something, and I'm something. And then we go around doing all this. We go around living our lives that way, always being bummed out, always being like disappointed in the final goal. It's always just this happiness is just elusive. We get that new car, we get that new job, we get that new partner, we get that new house, we get the new. We finish our project that we've been working on for 5 years, whatever it is, and then it's over. And then it's like, that just didn't do it. So that's kind of the cause of suffering, or the origin of suffering. So again, if you stop there, you could also kind of think, like, this is a bummer, God, I'm just like stuck in this trap, this wheel, this mouse wheel, But then the Buddha said, no, wait a second. It goes a little bit further. There is the possibility that this unsatisfactoriness, this suffering, can end. And it's called nirvana. It's called final liberation. And then this one ties right into then the truth of the path, the fourth noble truth, which is the truth of the path, which then, well, if there is this cessation of suffering, so if there's suffering, there's a cause for suffering, if there's a possibility for it to end, then, well, how do you get there? Well, how do you do it? And he says, well, here's what you do. You do these 8 things. So I've got them listed here. So we'll just touch on them again real briefly. Oh, it's 7:09 already. So we've got right view, which is basically that we look at things as being like not permanent, which is what we often just sort of on autopilot do, think that. So that, we look at things as being not permanent, not ultimately satisfactory. So that's one thing. Right aspiration, or engaging in the path with certainty and the motivation of love and compassion. We engage in right speech, because if we're always going around like lying and telling, being mean to people and things like that, we're not going to have equanimity of any kind, any sort of tranquility or anything like that, because we're going to be always worried about getting caught in our lies and our stories and be feeling guilty because we told this person off and all that sort of stuff. There's right action, which is ethical actions, which are things like not killing. Right speech falls into there too. There's a few other things as well. Then there's right livelihood, which is basically like not selling arms, weapons of mass destruction. That's pretty much a no-no. Just you're not going to get to enlightenment if you're doing that. So you got to stop that. And selling alcohol, being a butcher, things like that can be also things that are like not right livelihood. Then right effort, which is directing our energies on a daily basis to the path of liberation. So we get up in the morning and remind ourselves on a daily basis, okay, today what am I going to do? Am I just going to do stuff for myself, or am I going to follow this more spiritual path? Not that I need to completely go out and live in a cave. You can still have our relationships and our friends and our jobs and things like that, and take care of ourselves. But what's the main purpose of my life? And that right effort is like, I'm going to attain liberation for the benefit of all beings. So we try to cultivate that as much as we can day by day by day by day. Right mindfulness then is, cultivating mindfulness. Normally our minds are just here and there, past and future. I want this. I don't want that. She said this. Why did she say that? Oh my God, I can't stand that person. We're all over the place. We're not really mindful of what's going on in our minds. We're not mindful of what's going on in our bodies. We're not mindful of what other people are saying to us. When we're listening to other people talk, we're thinking about what we're going to say to them, and these sorts of things. So we cultivate right mindfulness. And then there's right samadhi, which is samadhi is a fancy word for a deep meditation, basically. So once we've attained this mindfulness, this ability to keep our mind stable on one thing, then we direct that stability to this more of our true nature, or the nature of our minds. Okay. And then I had a little note down there. The term right can be a little misleading because it can have a connotation of right and wrong, or like I'm right and you're not following the right view or whatever. So it's not like that at all. It's really more about it being, another translation for it is noble or excellent, perfected, things like that. So these things, we do them and we cultivate them into our lives on a daily basis, and then slowly, after doing other things and practices as well, we can attain the same realization that the Buddha realized. So that's really the uplifting thing, I think, about Buddhism, is that Siddhartha sat down and he put in the effort and he said, I'm going to do this, I'm going to attain liberation, and he did it. And what he found is not that like it made him special. He just saw things as they are. That's the main thing about the Buddha's teachings. It's not that he became I know that we do a lot of prostrations and things like that, a lot of reverence, a lot of praying and things like that. And this is all appropriate stuff, and we'll talk a little bit more about why we do that too. But the point of the Buddha's teachings is that we all can attain the same state that he did. So he's not a savior. He's not a figure. He's not a god. He's not someone that has any power over our lives whatsoever. All he did was sit down, do the work, have the realization, and then he taught how we can all do it ourselves. And that's why I personally am a Buddhist, because I found that to be totally inspiring, and it totally makes sense. It's like, yeah, that's something worthwhile, to try anyway, to try. It's going to take many lifetimes for us because we're ordinary, beings ourselves, but lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, it's possible. So that's what he's teaching. So anyway, so we've gotten through the first two parts of what I wanted to get through today. There's two big things left, but I think we'll just leave them as a quick explanation of what they are, and then you can read them later. Because these two things the Dalai Lama gives teachings, for example, on the Heart Perfection of Wisdom Sutra that last for days and days and days and days. And there's huge volumes of text written on what these few lines mean. And it's really the heart of the Buddha's wisdom teachings. So it's called the Heart Perfection of the Wisdom Sutra. This is part of the second turning of the wheel that we kind of alluded to here, the second sort of chunk of the Buddha's teachings. So this is something that you can go over by yourself at home, read it. If you're interested in bringing it into like a daily practice or anything like that, or a periodic practice where you want to just read it from time to time, do. It's very interesting. It's going to be probably almost indecipherable at first, but I think it'll speak to you a little bit. There's a really profound wisdom in it. So take a look at that at home on your own. If you have any questions about it or want some more, a little more information, it's something that if you have tasted a little bit of this and like, I want some more, you're gonna need to get a little more and a little more and a little more, and you could spend your whole life studying this one sutra, for example, and just still be like, yeah, I want more of that. Yeah, I want to understand it even more deeply, So it's not something you're going to read once and just be like, I didn't get that, or I'm just going to leave it, or we'll just leave it, So, and then the other sutra here is the Karaniya Metta Sutra, and so there's two kind of basic components to the Buddhist teachings. There's the teachings on wisdom, but then there's also the teachings on compassion. And it says that without one, it's like a bird with only one wing. So in order to fly, you need to have the two wings, wisdom and compassion. So this is just an example of some of the teachings on compassion that are out there from the Buddhist speech. So again, this is something that you can look over on your own and just kind of peruse and just read one of the verses, think about it, see how it makes you feel, explore it. So so that's about it for this class today. So I think I would just like to emphasize before we finish just kind of the main things about the Buddha's life are his realizations about the unsatisfactoriness aspect, and spend a little bit of time, if you have time, thinking about those three, especially those three things that he saw, old age, sickness, and death. And spend maybe the next week, if you can, a little bit of time every day, a few minutes, 5 minutes, and just go, is that true? Is it true that everyone, including myself, is going to grow old? Is it true that everyone, including myself, is going to get sick? Is it true that everyone I know, including myself, is going to die? And just kind of think about that. Not in a way that's going to make you bummed out or depressed or anything, although a little bit maybe is okay. That's kind of the point. We're supposed to generate this, this is unsatisfactory. This is a bummer. So, but just maybe spend some time thinking about those things. So I thank you all for being here today. It was really wonderful to have you all here. We'll just do a quick dedication of the merit. This is, again, a traditional thing we do at the end of any Buddhist practice, meditation, listening to teachings, whatever. We have a good motivation. We have the practice in the middle, and then we dedicate the merit. We dedicate the positive energy that we've generated here, and we say, may this positive merit bring liberation, happiness, ultimate happiness, and freedom from suffering for all sentient beings. So just as best we can, just generate that wish that this positive merit not go to waste. Oh yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody online.